Among all the main antagonists Luffy has faced in his journey, who was the most difficult to overcome? In my opinion, the toughest of them all wasn't Kaido, nor was it one of the five elders. Of course, Luffy's strength and that of his opponents have varied greatly over time. Therefore, this ranking is based purely on the perceived challenge at that moment and the sheer scale of the obstacle Luffy had to surmount. 6. Defeating Doflamingo. Why does Doflamingo rank only 6th? The difficulty in dealing with Doflamingo stemmed primarily from his inescapable bird cage, not from his direct confrontation with Luffy. In fact, if he weren't the main villain of an entire arc, a one-on-one fight with him would have been less challenging than his own subordinate, Cracker, who nearly caused Luffy to die from overeating. In the anime, Luffy's official fight with Doflamingo begins in episode 723 and ends with his defeat in episode 733, a mere 10 episodes. This short span even includes the downtime Luffy needed to wait for his Gear 4th to recharge. It felt as though even the anime's production team was struggling to find ways to pad the runtime. Before activating Gear 4th, Luffy was already capable of trading blows with Doflamingo, with both sides dealing damage. Once Gear 4th was unleashed, Luffy completely overwhelmed him. The momentum was entirely one-sided. He rained down a barrage of punches and kicks on Doflamingo, leaving him battered and bloody, while he could only muster a few weak counterattacks. Even after Doflamingo awakened his devil fruit, he failed to impose any significant threat on Luffy. On the contrary, he was unceremoniously pinned to the central plateau of Dressrosa by a single Leo bazooka. At this point, Luffy's Gear 4th timed out, but fortunately, his allies were there to buy him time, and Doflamingo couldn't even locate him. Because of this, the sense of hopelessness Doflamingo created was never truly potent, which is a key reason for his lower difficulty ranking. Shortly after, Luffy returned and finished him off with a single, decisive King Konkan. Throughout the entire battle, Luffy was never pushed to his absolute limit. He maintained an overwhelming offensive presence from start to finish. Once Doflamingo was defeated, the problem of the birdcage resolved itself. However, considering his incredible endurance, he was still a tougher opponent than the likes of Enel, Moria, or Caesar. 5. Defeating Rob Lucci. The Enies Lobby arc is widely regarded as one of the most iconic arcs in One Piece, featuring some of its most spectacular battles. The reason for this is that the power gap between Luffy and Lucci wasn't a vast chasm. Lucci was only slightly stronger, which made their entire fight incredibly tense and fierce, a crucial element of its appeal. But was Lucci really that difficult to beat? Initially, Lucci dominated Luffy in terms of pure physical prowess. However, after Luffy activated Gear 2nd, he was immediately able to fight back. Lucci himself had to acknowledge Luffy's grit, and from that point, the battle entered its explosive climax. In the exchanges that followed, both landed significant blows, but Lucci still held a clear advantage. That is, until a Gear 3rd punch from Luffy nearly knocked him unconscious and critically injured his leg, creating a fatal weakness for the remainder of the fight. Despite this, Lucci maintained his edge, repeatedly drawing blood from Luffy and landing 3 Rokugan attacks, including his most powerful version. Ultimately, however, Lucci was powerless against the protagonist's insane endurance and plot armor. Compounded by his leg injury, all he could do was use Tekyai to brace for the final onslaught. Defeating Lucci was by no means easy, but at the very least, Luffy always had the strength to keep fighting back. 4. Defeating Crackalot. From the perspective of that time, the sense of overwhelming power and the sheer difference in strength that Crackalot projected was nearly on par with Kaido. In their first encounter, Luffy was utterly outmatched. Furthermore, at that point in the story, Logia-type double fruits were considered invincible, and Luffy had no way to even touch him. He was lucky to escape with his life thanks only to Robin's intervention. When Luffy returned for a second round, he was once again effortlessly defeated and tossed from the palace walls. By a stroke of luck, the water Luffy had been carrying was absorbed by a Crackalot, and then happened to fall back onto Luffy, which completely changed the dynamic, as Luffy realized that his own blood worked just like water, allowing him to make physical contact with the warlord. It's hard to argue this wasn't a case of plot convenience. How could a man who can dehydrate a person into a living mummy be thwarted by a few drops of blood on Luffy's fist? But even in defeat, Crackalot nearly finished Luffy with his poison hook. And once again, Luffy was saved by Robin, who provided the antidote. In the end, it seems Crackalot didn't lose to Luffy. He clearly lost to Robin. Despite the plot-driven nature of the fight's conclusion, the hellish level of difficulty Crackalot presented in the initial stages was undeniable. Therefore, taking everything into account, this battle was more challenging than the one against Lucci. 3. Defeating Kaido. In a pure one-on-one scenario, Kaido undoubtedly dominated Luffy for the majority of their fight. He could have easily beaten Luffy to death on multiple occasions. So why isn't he ranked as the most difficult opponent? It comes back to the same point. The feeling of utter despair just wasn't as intense. Although Luffy was knocked unconscious by Kaido several times, he was surrounded by an incredible amount of powerful support. The constant presence of his crewmates provided a crucial sense of security. He was repeatedly saved and aided by his crew and allies. Furthermore, throughout the battle, Luffy's potential was continuously unlocked by his teacher, Kaido, which gradually lowered the fight's difficulty. After mastering Advanced Conqueror's Haki, Luffy could finally go toe-to-toe with Kaido, and after awakening Gear 5th, the overwhelming presence Kaido once commanded completely vanished. When one of Kaido's signature moves, his devastating Great Wisdom King Thunder Bakwa, struck Gear 5th Luffy and was treated like a complete joke, it became clear that Kaido's defeat was inevitable. Nevertheless, this was a battle against the Yonko, and the difficulty was built up to be immense from the very beginning. Overall, defeating Kaido was still a more arduous task than defeating Lucci or Crackalot was for Luffy at those respective times. 2. Defeating Katakuri. Why was Katakuri so formidably difficult? He is the only antagonist who essentially admitted defeat and even intentionally lowered the fight's difficulty himself. When Luffy faces other antagonists, you typically feel that once he awakens a new power, he'll gradually gain the upper hand and the challenge will decrease. With Katakuri, it was the exact opposite. From the outset, Katakuri surpassed Luffy in every single aspect: strength, speed, haki, and devil fruit abilities. To make matters worse, their battle took place in the enclosed, inescapable Marrow world. There were no crewmates, no reinforcements. This created a profound sense of isolated despair. Luffy activates his powerful Gear 4th. You'd think he could win, right? Absolutely not. Katakuri used his future sight to morph his body and evade every attack, making him seem virtually invincible. Luffy awakens his own future sight. Surely he can win now. Still no. Katakuri's proficiency with future sight was on an entirely different level. Luffy unleashes his new form, Gear 4th Snake Man. This has to be it, right? Still not enough. Katakuri remained unfazed by Snake Man, continuing to dominate and punish Luffy. So Luffy combined Snake Man with Future Sight. This time, victory is certain, isn't it? The answer is still no. Even then, Katakuri could dodge and weave, exploiting the smallest openings to land direct hits right up until their final clash of wills. And even after that ultimate exchange, it was Katakuri who was left standing first. Of course, the fight included Katakuri's honorable act of stabbing himself to lower the difficulty after his sister interfered. By the time the battle concluded, besides taking a heavy blow, Luffy's legs were so severely injured that he had to be carried away by Pakams and Sanji, having lost almost all mobility. The physical toll on Luffy was comparable to his fight with Lucci, but Katakuri maintained an overwhelming advantage from beginning to end, and the final outcome was at best a draw. Therefore, considering everything, the difficulty against Lucci, Crackalot, and Kaido, none of them were as hard as the fight against Katakuri. After all, this was an opponent Luffy gave his absolute all against and still couldn't decisively defeat. 1. Facing Magellan. Of all the antagonists Luffy has ever confronted, the one who instilled the most profound sense of hopelessness was Magellan. Luffy has never known fear, no matter how powerful his opponent. But against Magellan, for the only time in the series, he was genuinely terrified. If it weren't for Bon Clay and Invacon, Luffy's story would have ended right there. As the Warden of Impel down, Magellan didn't just deal with Luffy, he single-handedly took down the entire Blackbeard crew in an instant. At that time, Luffy was accompanied by 2 warlords, the poison expert Inbakan, and an entire army of escapees, yet the difficulty didn't diminish in the slightest. No one could stop Magellan. Thanks to Mr. Three's wax armor, Luffy managed to hold on for a short while, but when Magellan unleashed his ultimate attack, the entire escapee army was sent into a chaotic retreat. They were all cornered at the docks, with their only options being recapture or jumping into the sea. Magellan, all by himself, recreated the desperation of a Dunkirk-style evacuation. Watching that part of the story, you couldn't help but feel a palpable sense of anxiety and despair for Luffy and his group. In the end, it was only thanks to Jinbei summoning the whale sharks and Bon Clay's heroic sacrifice that they managed a hair's breadth escape. Therefore, what's harder than a difficult fight is a fight you don't even have a chance of winning. Eking out a victory against Katakuri was a monumental struggle.